Good morning, I'm Katrina Pritchard.
And I'm Helen Williams.
And together we are Breaking Binaries Research, and this is our Pride presentation. Before we get into the detail, we're going to tell you a little bit more about Breaking Binaries.
We co-founded Breaking Binaries in 2022 to explore diverse and complex identities at work. There is a emerging gap in terms of understanding individuals, particularly those with marginalised sexualities and genders. And so much of our research within Breaking Binaries focuses on that. And we have a number of different projects involved at the moment, including looking at negotiating differences at work, which explores stigmatised identities and disclosing those identities at work, particularly in small and medium-sized businesses, and that's funded by the CIPD. We've completed a project that looks at entrepreneurs and inequalities in entrepreneurship, so looking at LGBTQIA plus entrepreneurs and their experiences there. And we also teach, obviously, amongst all of that.
At School of Management, Swansea University.
We are really passionate about qualitative methods, and particularly improving the standard of qualitative research within organisation studies where we sit. And we also, most importantly, have our fantastic podcast, Prefer Not to Say.
New episodes coming soon, I think, yes.
Helen. And it's Happy Pride Month for us. So this is a really important podcast. Obviously, it sits and fits really well with our research and what we believe in, and the values that we also believe in, as part of our own standing.
So we are recording this as part of Swansea University's own Pride celebrations. I'm not sure an academic presentation is usually pitched as a celebration, but we've also been delighted to take part in Pontardawe's first Pride last week, which was great fun. So we are today we are going to talk a little bit about our approach to researching diverse genders, sexes and sexualities, and explaining some of the academic background to that. Oh, we've incorrectly left an item on the agenda here, Helen, because we're going to try and keep it quite short. We are not going to be unpacking imposter syndrome as a symptom of inequity. We're going to save that for a forthcoming podcast. But after I've talked a little bit about the quite heavy in places academic stuff, Helen will be sharing some of our research that we've done exploring the policy landscape. So with that little faux pas very easily brushed over, we will move on.
We've just set the scene for later, enticed you to come back for more.
So let's start by looking at some of the challenges of understanding when we talk about genders, sexes and sexualities, what do we actually mean? So we wanted to start by explaining a little bit about why we called ourselves Breaking Binaries, and that the notion of a binary has been around for a very long time. We live our lives often surrounded by all sorts of binaries, but gender has been long established as a fairly straightforward binary between men and women, and sex obviously also or perceived as a binary between male and female. These things have been around had been around, perhaps we should say, for a very long time. And for quite a long time, we assumed, or it could have been assumed, that gender and sex were actually the same thing. But through the 1950s and 60s, we saw an emerging sort of feminist movement and other movements that strove to differentiate the social constructed and lived experience of gender as different from biological sex. And so we've been regarding as gender, although still as a binary between men and women, as socially constructed and as various according to lived experience for quite a long time. However, more recently, we've seen challenges to the idea that it is only gender that is social constructed, with more attention being drawn to the way that what is often called biological sex which had previously often been assumed to be this natural, very straightforward separation at birth between identifying an individual as male or female, and that as being a fixed state, that has also become regarded as constructed. Firstly, because the process by which gender is assigned at birth is relatively haphazard and relies very much on external appearance. And so for a long time, there's been this worry that that has not recognised the complexity of our biology. But also because of the increasing ability for individuals to change or manage their biology and their sex. So there's been two challenges in that. And just for the sake of clarity, our position is very much that it is perfectly, we should recognise and accept an individual's right to define both their sex and their gender according to their preference. So we join the move that looks at sex as socially constructed rather than a fixed variable. So from that, and there's some other detail on the slide, we would say that both the male-female sex binary and the men-women gender binary are problematic.
And part of our acknowledgement is that, and we've said this in a podcast previously, which you may want to listen to as well, is we do not see knowledge as fixed either. And part of the issue with the politicization of the discussion of sex as a biological and a fixed biological state is that it acknowledges that knowledge doesn't progress with that either. And the determination of sex is very complex. We're not experts in that. It's, at all.
When you pointed to me, so we're not experts.
We are not experts in that. However, it is very complex, and it's not simply just about your reproductive organs. There are whole other parts. There are lots of different parts to play, not literally, in that. And so we are very much of the opinion that it is about acknowledging the progression of knowledge and also acknowledging the individual's right to self-determine who they are. And a combination of those things is really important in the progression of understanding in this area.
So binaries are problematic for another reason as well, which is that usually what happens in binaries is that the one half of the binary becomes recognized over time, either deliberately or by a period of sort of social adjustment, as being the good side of the binary, where the other becomes more associated with negative characteristics. Historically, we would have said this is what happened with men and women as an original binary in any case. The characteristics of the male, strength, being rational and stoic, became, particularly in work contexts, assumed to be the characteristics of a good worker. So binaries binaries work like this in any case. It isn't just about the more recent understandings. So what happens with that good half of the binary is that becomes used or seen as the norm. So we lose sight of the political and the power relations that are embedded in these binary notions. So with gender, for example, we would say that for a long time, the way that has played out is between men and not men. So anyone who doesn't identify with the stereotypical masculinized male identity has become othered. And we also see the way that plays out with sexuality, which is often reduced to a straight versus othered or not straight binary, so that the heteronormativity continues to dominate our understandings of all, not just at work, but of our social lives more broadly.
It's very well explained.
Thank you very much.
Can I add a point to that?
You can. Can I stay on this slide?
Yes. So generally, what what we see is a pattern when you see things that become to disrupt these stable structures, for example, like gender and masculine and feminine. Anything that comes forth to start disrupting these structures or threaten or seem like they're going to threaten these well-established structures, these well-established privileged and non-privileged structures, is seen and often regarded and discussed broadly in the mainstream as a threat. And so what you see in this and in the kind of narratives is this continual othering of the unknown, and it's often seen as a threat. And then when it becomes to some extent never fully accepted and part and part of society in particular ways, often that threat disappears to some extent. But it's always this process and this pattern that we see continually, particularly with the within this context.
So as part of this disruption of the binary, we've seen a huge emergence of terms being used by individuals and by groups to describe genders, sexes, and sexualities. Sometimes these are consolidated into umbrella terms. The university tends to use LGBT plus as its umbrella terms. Others extend to LGBTQIA plus or other combinations of acronyms. But those acronyms are umbrella terms and cover a huge diverse experience and preference in terms of how people identify themselves. So we, as we've already said, recognise the right of individuals to identify any of these terms and including multiple terms, and to change the way in which they identify themselves over time as well. And as part of this, we also see an emerging number of pronouns in use beyond the traditional binary. So being clear on terminology, and we often talk about minority genders or marginalized genders in our academic work as an umbrella term, and being clear on the terminology is really important. But for us, it's not the academic definitions that matter as much as how individuals choose to identify and represent themselves twice even on the slide, a bit of editing for later. So in our research, for example, when we present in our academic papers the sort of table of participants, we always ask our participants how they would like to be identified. So we don't try and categorize individuals through our academic process. We're always very clear to represent the sometimes and often, in fact, multiple identities that people might wish to declare as part of our research.
It also acknowledges that these parts of our identities are not fixed, and that they are, for some individuals, always in transition in particular aspects of themselves and how they identify, and that particular parts of ourselves are continually evolving, more for others than some. But it just acknowledges this as very much down to the individual.
And as part of our research, I think we would suggest that much of the research around gender in organisation studies has largely been research about cis women. That has been sorely needed, and we don't wish to suggest that that hasn't been the case, because obviously prior to that, most of the research in organisations was about cis men. So we obviously needed to redress that. But what we have seen now is that we suggest we need now to push beyond that. So where, in the same way that heteronormativity has started to be challenged, particularly in academia, but obviously also in everyday life, we also suggest the need to challenge cisnormativity, which is this assumption that individuals are cisgender or identify as either male or female, and those are the only options available. So we're emerging from that, cisgenderism is this prejudicial ideology that other identities are less valid, and that emerges as part of this sort of binary construction that we mentioned previously. And we do stress the need to be careful around conflating sex, gender, and sexualities. because for good reasons, within the communities, there has often been a coalescing under this umbrella for political reasons to garner support, to make the case for particular rights, etc. So LGBTQIA+ has a use for different communities, particularly the smaller communities who can benefit in some ways from that association. However, we need to bear in mind that those umbrella terms often include gender, sex, and sexualities, and those are not experienced the same by many individuals within those communities. And some individuals can be, some labels can be used in multiple ways. Sometimes they are used to denote a sexuality. In other cases, they may be used to denote a gender or sex identity. Just to add some further complexity is the issue of intersectionality, an issue that we recognise because sexes, genders and sexualities is already quite a lot of complexity, quite a lot of intersectional complexity there. But obviously we recognise that the experiences of individuals vary hugely depending on their wider identity in terms of aspects like age, like disability, like ethnicity, for example. And intersectionally, put very simply, recognises that your multiple experience is multiply disadvantaged the more minority identities you possess or identify with. So put very simply, it's the case that 1 + 1 = 3, that if you identify as disabled and as Black, for example, your experience of disadvantage is not the same as adding each of those up and getting a double identity. It would in fact be a double disadvantage. It would in fact be tripled. So this is something within our research that we are increasingly alert to, particularly around issues of disability, mental health, and also age. At both younger and older, experiences vary quite significantly in the way that disadvantage plays out.
And what we find in our research specifically is that it's incredibly complex to talk about and discuss intersectionality in a way that helps to really emphasize what participants tell us in the way that they tell us. So it's something that we grapple with as to how do we better communicate intersectional experiences and intersectional experiences of disadvantage, because it's very much about, depending on what context you're in, parts of your identity which are disadvantaged may be more emphasized than others, and in some cases all of them might be. So it's really challenging to think about how we can better represent that in research and also in discussions more broadly.
So Helen's now going to tell you a little bit about some research we've been doing.
Yes, so one of the projects that we've completed as part of Breaking Binaries research was funded by the Institute of Small Business and Entrepreneurship, ISB. And this project looked at entrepreneurs operating in the UK who identified as within the LGBTQIA+ community.
Our slides got a little bit messed up here, I've noticed.
I don't know what happened.
I don't know what happened
there. So don't worry about the slides. I'm going to tell you about it anyway. Very much off the cuff. Is Pride. We're just going to go with it. So
it is also early in the morning. we would like to caveat
it is also quite early in the morning, but we'll remain professional for this. So as part of this project, we interviewed a number of different entrepreneurs based across the UK who identified within and across the LGBTQIA+ community, and we also conducted a policy review of policy that discussed small business and entrepreneurship. So it covers quite a lot when we started to unpack it, and we looked at that policy review across the UK. We excluded Northern Ireland at the time because the government was
the devolved government was not
active. Yeah, so we excluded them. So we looked at Scotland, England, Wales, and then we also looked at UK government policy more broadly as an umbrella, which it often is. So we looked at those different data points. Next slide.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was a really interesting project. And what we came out with was that there's a lot of work to do in this area. The first stage is that we conducted a content analysis where we simply looked at how and what language was used and to what extent it was used that covered areas of diversity, equity and equality within these policies. So essentially content analysis, we just counted the frequency of terms and that was a really interesting in and of itself in terms of what was present and also what was absent, more importantly. So you can see in the two tables in front of you, if we look at the content analysis overall summary table, you can see that there's lots of discussion of equality, ethnicity, these broad umbrella terms, which we are all very familiar with in our day-to-day lives, and especially our working lives. You can see discussion of gender and specifically women was there. But as soon as we start unpacking and looking at specific identities that sit within the framework of equity and equality, it starts to become rather less. We were really surprised to see very few references, for example, to non-binary and non-binary identities, and especially transgender identities. You can see in the UK and England policies and in Wales policies, there was no discussion or mention of transgender.
It's probably worth just very quickly, given we're situated in Wales, saying that we conducted this research before Wales's LGBT plan was published, literally just before that was published. So that was, we have a fuller report available from our blog if you're interested. And so we make that clear that that was not included in this research. And the only other point to make, if I may, Helen, is just to say that while we've used terms in the table for simplicity, in our actual searching, we used all the variants and complicated variations of LGBT, for example. So we searched for any way in which that acronym could occur, and similarly we looked at abbreviations like trans versus transgender, non-binary, hyphenated, not hyphenated, etc., etc. So this is a somewhat simplified representation of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And these policies, and I think, and what's relevant about policy is policy dictates where resource is allocated in order to drive agenda. So it's really important from our perspective to understand how policy is framed, because that really suggests what the priorities of that particular government are at the time, and therefore the departments and the individuals that sit within that. And of course, we know that policy also drives research and research agendas and research funding. So there's a lot of structures that shape where resource is pitched, and that is what makes an impact and a difference. And as you can see in the table on the right, specifically when we looked at gender policy, so this is policy which is framed and specifically targeted at gender, mainly women, we found that actually when it comes to looking at gender beyond simply understanding gender as women, and often men were not discussed at all, interestingly, you can see that the references become even more invisible to those within the LGBTQIA plus acronym.
It won't be surprising to see that Scotland, for example, was the one place in which there was wider discussion. Obviously, things in Scotland have also changed. Even in the year since we published this report, we've seen a change in leadership. We've seen, obviously, and things may well change again with the general election forthcoming. Just one more thing to note, because we were interested to see whether intersectionality was referenced, and there were a couple of references to intersectionality. We also searched for ethnicity and variations of BAME as an acronym to see whether we could look and find any discussions of intersectionality. And we were also interested to see how LGBT as an acronym worked whether it worked in the same way or similar ways to BAME works as an acronym. So that's the reason that we included those in our research. Shall I move on?
Yes, absolutely.
So Helen's now going to go through the thematic analysis and discuss some of our participant responses.
So the next part of research, so we did the content analysis where we looked at policy documents. Then after that, we went and talked to entrepreneurs through which some of these policy documents were aimed at. So people who had started their own businesses across the UK and were part of the LGBTQIA plus communities and identified within and across that community and those communities as well. And we used the policy documents in those interviews and discussed those policy documents with those entrepreneurs. And you can see in front of you, these are the quotes in the purple speech bubbles are quotes from our participants, and the quotes in the orange are quotes from policy that we used in the interviews to discuss our participants' thoughts and perceptions on how the policy was framed. So we did a thematic analysis, a reflexive thematic analysis. Was it reflexive or just?
Oh, yes, it was.
It was a reflective
yes,
thematic analysis. Just want to check.
We explain this more detailed in our report.
We do indeed. We came up with sort of 3 overarching themes and thematic areas of interest that came from our analysis. The first one being visibly vague. And this really explored how, while terminology was present, participants tended to highlight and identify that there was no depth or nothing behind it. It was simply just particular terms seemed to be cherry-picked and used in particular parts of documents. So you can see
also this idea that this sense that talking about everybody and all and, you know, inclusivity in really generic terms, not even identifying particular groups, was really felt to be disingenuous, really, wasn't it, by our participants? We haven't included some of the stronger statements in this particular presentation, but it was really not considered in much depth, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And you can see from that content analysis in the policy, there's lots of discussion of equality and equity in these big terms. And you can, from participant 3's quote, it quite nicely captures this sense that, you know, while there's acknowledgement that things aren't quite right, you know, participant 3 says, I feel like it just lacks any nuance, really. It's just like you're getting plonked with everybody else because it just sounds great that you're getting listed. And this is this, you know, you're there, you're visible there, but in terms of lack of depth and acknowledgement of difference, that's the vagueness that was coming through.
So this also leads into this discussion of pseudo visibility.
And this really started to become more apparent as we discussed with participants the ambitions that policy would often set out and the goals that policy documents often set out. So participant 8 says here, it's just disappointing. That's as far as they can go with equality without even thinking of sort of like different subsections, because people who are neurodiverse and BAME are going to face very different things from a white neurodiverse person. So what essentially participants were starting to converge around here and discuss was this sense that whilst there was specific reference to categories of difference who may be experiencing disadvantage, there was no acknowledgement of the complexity of those disadvantages and intersectional experiences of disadvantage. And interestingly, that in participant 10 provides a different angle to this, saying, I've been put on programs that are like, oh, environmentalists who are women, or like other stuff where they're trying their best to support people who are marginalized by their gender, i.e. just women. And support that's out there is often just for women. And this is in reference this was a participant who was non-binary and therefore did not feel comfortable and does not identify as a woman. So while they may be identified as an environmentalist, it was assumed that they were a woman and therefore put in a support program for that. Yeah, and these are the issues, the lack of kind of intersectional understanding throughout policy. And that's where that pseudo visibility comes through. And then we end with, we've got this sort of scale, if you think about it, this kind of grey scale, and then we end really with this complete lack of visibility whatsoever with our final theme, invisible. And here really participants started to, you could really hear the frustration in interviews from participants in discussing this, and that this is where binary and discussions of things in a binary way render many individual identities as completely invisible within
a lot of this surrounded discussions of the gender pay gap, which straight away sets up the binary men versus women, and anyone else is just lost in that discussion at all. There was no other discussion. And also, as we see in that second quote, the idea that fairness is about, as long as you've got representations of men and women, then that is fair. And doesn't even acknowledge, sorry, Ellen.
No, it's absolutely, and the point, this last point I just want to draw to the, you know, there's lots of discussion around STEM, and this is interesting, you know, because we're in a higher education environment, there's lots of discussion of STEM and the lack of women in STEM, but that's not the only gender that is marginalized and a minority within this, and it's the recognition that there are more genders, and more, you know, more legal genders, of course, and policy does not represent that, and it's not there, and therefore many of these marginalized genders and sexualities are completely invisible within policy.
So we are now moving to write up this research in more detail, and we'd obviously like to really thank the participants in the project, as well as ISB for funding it, who particularly the participants who gave so much of their time. And we're now taking this and developing it further, but at the same time we're not standing still. We're also doing more research. So we have moved a little bit beyond individual entrepreneurs, and we're particularly interested in speaking to individuals who identify as, in any way or multiple ways, LGBTQIA+, but work for small organisations, and in the UK, small and medium organisations, that's those with less than 250 employees. But beyond that, we've also got a qualitative survey out for LGBTQIA+ employees working for any size of organisation. And so we've put both those details here. You'll also be able to find out further details on our blog.
Absolutely.
But thank you very much for listening. This has been our Pride presentation.
Happy Pride, everyone.